Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. Good morning, everyone. I am Leah M. Forney. I'm the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate and Training Assistant here at MCASA, and I am before you all to talk about serving sexual assault survivors from underserved populations. So just a quick overview. We will be talking about underserved populations. We'll touch on topics like identity. We'll get into incarcerated survivors. We'll talk a little bit about oppression and trauma. We'll talk a little bit about barriers to access. And then as we wrap up, we'll get into moving forward and we'll touch on equity as well as the socio-ecological model. So to get started, let's talk about who is the underserved and why, right? So what do we mean when people are discussing underserved populations? Well, the first thing I want us to know is that sexual assault survivors as a whole is underserved, right? Sexual violence is 100% preventable, yet it is still happening every single day, right? And it is happening every single day to people of all identities and all backgrounds. All sexual abuse survivors experience barriers to justice and healing that they deserve. And so today we're going to talk about the survivors who may face additional barriers and trauma solely because of their intersecting identities. So these survivors may be underserved by our organizations because of our cultural attitudes, our beliefs about their identity, or our lack of awareness and understanding about their identity, about systematic oppression, and about the people that hold those identities. So let's talk a little bit about identity. Now, the first thing I want to know is that this is not an exhaustive list, right? And so we're going to briefly go through each category. I'll give a few examples, right? Some of you may be familiar with some of these identity groups as well. So the first one is age, right? Age is also one aspect of our identity. So when we talk about age, we're talking about things like younger versus older, right? And so culture views and treat people differently based on how they view age, right? So, for example, in some European cultures, the elderly are oftentimes regarded as and highly respected, and others, right, not so much. There's also cases where we've seen maybe the elderly population living separately from the younger generation, right? So oftentimes they may be in like a nursing home or an assisted living. And then in Asian cultures, we tend to see that those getting old is seen as a positive thing, right? So the elderly is treated with a lot of respect, right? And a lot of care from their children. Race. Race is a social construct, right? And so when we're typically talking about race, we're talking about skin color. So black, brown, white, mixed race, biracial, multiracial. That is what we're talking about when we talk about race. Ethnicity. So ethnicity talks about cultural and shared heritage and language. So when we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about things like Latinx, Pacific Islander, Afro-Caribbean, European American. Now, it's important to know that ethnicity is not necessarily tied to race, and it's also not necessarily tied to geography either. Ethnicity focuses more on culture. So this is where communities have culture. So when we're talking about, again, ethnicity, we're also talking about like the Jewish community, deaf and hard of hearing community, right? And then we have national origin. So national origin gets into the geography, right, of an individual. So then we're looking at things like Australian, German, Bolivian, Japanese. Another form of identity is skin color. So when we're talking about skin color, we're talking about things like light skin, dark skin, brown, right? It's important to note that skin color is oftentimes intersected with race, right? And so people can base racial identities based on someone's skin color, right? So for example, someone can be black or light skinned, or Black and dark-skinned. Someone can be Asian and light-skinned or Asian and dark-skinned. Someone can be albino with non-pigmented skin, but also identify as Black, both racially and culturally. Then we have disability. So disability and in terms of identity looks at things like mental illness, physical disability, cognitive disability. Another piece of our identity could be deaf or hard of hearing. And so it's important to note that some individuals do not identify this as a disability and some do. Then we have faith, religion, and spirituality as a part of our identity. Then we have gender identity and expression, right? So this is when we're talking gender identity and expression, it is the gender that someone identifies with. Again, it's important to know that this is not necessarily tied to the sex that they were assigned at birth. So when we're talking gender identity, we're talking things like man, woman, cisgender, transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, gender queer. It's all in how they express their gender, right? We're also talking things like, do they express feminine, masculine, right? That's what we're referring to when we're talking gender identity and expression. Another form of our identity can be sexual and or romantic orientation. So this is defined by the gender or genders that a person is sexually and or romantically attracted to. So this is when we get into identities such as lesbian, bisexual, gay, asexual, aromantic, biromantic, queer, right? Another aspect to our identity is socioeconomic status and class, right? Tack that on with another form of our identity could be tribal or indigenous affiliation. Tack that on with what we call first language. And so first language is often the language that someone learns to speak first, right? So if English was the first language you learned, that would be your first language. If Spanish was the language that you learned to speak first, that would be your first language. Tack that on with immigration status. So when we're looking at immigration status, we're looking at things like citizen, temporary or permanent resident, asylum seeker, refugee, unauthorized, undocumented, right? And then the last part of our identity could be body size. And body size really looks at weight discrimination, right? And oftentimes how people can often be biased or prejudiced towards individuals of certain body sizes. The one thing that I want to note about this identity is that these identity groups have hierarchies set up within each group, right? And so these hierarchies stem from our national and global history. And so within the hierarchy, the identities on the top, so we're looking at from age to skin color, right, are referred to as dominant identities. And those at the bottom, so we're looking at from socioeconomic status to body size, are oftentimes referred to as marginalized identities. Dominant identities are considered the norm or the standard, right? And they're oftentimes highly valued in our society, whereas marginalized identities are seen as abnormal or wrong, and they're oftentimes inconvenienced in our society. For context, it is important to share that some examples of our dominant identities here in the United States would be like wealthy, Christian, white, able-bodied, born in the US, thin or athletic build, speaks English as their first language. So people that hold those identities are oftentimes seen as normal and highly valued, and they oftentimes hold more power as they move throughout society. The other thing to note is that identities that are considered marginalized are identity groups that have been, again, culturally, historically, systematically, and institutionally oppressed. Some examples of that would be women and feminine identifying people, gay, lesbian, bisexual people, Native or Indigenous people, immigrants, Jewish people, dark-skinned people, fat-bodied people, people that live within poverty. People who hold marginalized identities do not hold as much power moving through society and may face a lot of barriers throughout life solely because of these identities. So now let's talk a little bit about incarcerated survivors. So why incarcerated survivors are considered underserved populations? Again, when we're talking about underserved populations, we need to also consider those who are incarcerated survivors. And so the PREA, or Prison Rape Elimination Act, was passed to address sexual violence within correctional facilities and to provide support for those experiencing it. It is important to know that there are protections involved when it comes to incarcerated survivors. And even though there are protections in place, incarcerated survivors oftentimes still navigate institutional barriers to make accessing care incredibly difficult. So why PREA? I absolutely love this picture from Just Detention. And the reason why I love this picture is because it humanizes incarcerated survivors, right? So if we take a look at this picture for a second, it asks a really important question. If you look to your left of the woman, right? If this woman was being raped, would you help her? For many of us, right? If someone is in a plain clothes, you probably would say yes, right? But what about if she was in prison attire? Does she still deserve the same amount of help, the same amount of resources as somebody that's on the outside? Or what about the man in the picture? If you knew that this person, right, was being raped, would you joke around them? Would you joke about it? Or what about now if they're in prison attire? This picture is a very sobering reminder of just how important incarcerated survivors are to the conversation of underserved populations and sexual violence. So here's what I want you to know, that no one deserves to be sexually abused, and every survivor deserves support. Incarcerated survivors already have issues accessing rehabilitation services. And it's even more important to know that sexual violence should never be a part of the penalty. Just because someone did something, they committed a crime, they had to end up going to prison, does not mean that they deserve to be sexually violated while they're incarcerated. It is not a part of the sentence. And so it's also important to know that all survivors deserve the support in their path towards healing, regardless of the environment in which sexual violence occurred, right? Additionally, regardless of the crime someone may have committed. Again, sexual violence and rape should never be a part of the punishment. And so the state's job is really to take on the care and safety of the inmates. And part of that is providing a facility in which inmates can live and work without experiencing sexual violence. Another thing I want you to know is that sexual violence within detention is also a public health issue, right? The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that an upwards of 200,000 people are sexually abused behind bars annually. Let that sink in for a minute. With many of these survivors experiencing more than one violent incident. So we have 200,000 people sexually abused, incarcerated annually, and many of them are sexually abused repeatedly. And of those that are sexually abused repeatedly, 10% of former state inmates reported that they were sexually abused during the last period of detention, meaning closer to their release date. So just when they're about to get ready to go home and be with their loved ones, they're now faced with sexual abuse. This is why incarcerated survivors is a part of underserved populations. So let's talk a little bit about PREA. So PREA was essentially passed in 2003, and the standards were issued by the DOJ in 2012. And so the purpose of PREA is to do a few things. One, it was to establish a zero tolerance standard for the incidence of prison rape in prisons within the United States. right? It was also to make the prevention of prison rape top priority in each prison system. Another purpose of PREA was to develop and implement national standards for the detection, prevention, reduction, and discipline when sexual violence occurs. Another purpose of PREA was to increase the available data and information on the incidence of prison rape. So we started tracking how often this is happening, when it is happening, what type of institutions it's happening in. Another purpose is to improve the management and administration of correctional facilities. Another purpose is to standardize the definitions used for collecting the data on incidents of prison rape. So making sure that in all facilities, we're using the same definitions. PREA's purpose is also to increase the accountability of prison officials who fail to detect, prevent, reduce, and punish for prison rape. PREA was also established with the purpose to protect the Eighth Amendment rights of federal, state, and local prisoners. Its also purpose was to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of federal expenditures through grant programs such as those dealing with healthcare, mental health care, disease prevention, crime prevention, investigation, and prosecution, prison construction, maintenance and operation, race relations, poverty, unemployment and homelessness. And lastly, PREA was put in place to reduce the cost that prison rape imposes on interstate commerce. Now, it is important to know that there are different sets of standards for different types of facilities, and we'll talk a little bit about those. It's also important to know that the responsibility to comply with PREA falls on the individual agency, not anybody working within the community. So it doesn't fall on mental health providers. It doesn't fall on the Rape Crisis Center. It falls on the correctional facility. So when a facility is audited and found to be out of compliance with PREA, the responsibility to make those actionable changes and to ensure compliance again falls right back on the facility. So if you're ever a part of a PREA audit and they're found to be out of compliance, don't let nobody tell you that it is your responsibility. It is the agency's responsibility. It's the facility's responsibility to make sure that they get back into compliance. So here is the breakdown of the facilities here in Maryland. So federal level, we have our prisons. State level, we have some prisons. We also have juvenile facilities. And then we have what we call community confinement. On the local level, we have jails, lockups, and also we have some community confinement. And then we have immigration detention, known as ICE, as a separate locale in Maryland. So in Maryland, there are many relevant agencies. So we have the Federal Bureau of Prisons, right? And so they have one facility in Maryland, which is the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland. Then we have the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. They run our state prison system. We have our Department of Juvenile Services, DJS, who runs all of our juvenile facilities. And then we have our County Department of Corrections, our DOC, who runs the local jails and detention centers pretty much in every county except Baltimore City. And then our local police departments are the ones that run the lockups. So it's important to note that, as I mentioned before, that there are different sets of PREA standards to different types of facilities, right? Federal law states that individual states stand to lose federal funding if they do not comply with PREA. Specifically, they risk losing 5% of federal funding if they choose to remain out of compliance. Now, I will say that some states have opted out altogether to not have any type of federal funding, and others have certified that they will use that federal funding to become more compliant with PREA. The other thing I want you all to know is that federal prisons typically house people after they've been convicted, and they typically house inmates that have sentences over a year and or felony convictions. Uh, and then also prisons are typically managed by federal or state governments, depending on uh, where they're located. The other thing to note is that jails typically house people waiting for trial or are in what we call pre-conviction. Some do house people in post-conviction that have shorter sentences. So typically when we're talking jails, we're talking a year or less. When we're talking prison, we're talking a year or more. Jails can also house people that are waiting to be transferred to another facility. And also, oftentimes our jails are managed by the county or the city. For lockups, they're oftentimes managed by local law enforcement agencies. And again, these are for individuals who have very short periods of time. So they're usually there for 72 hours and then they're either released or transferred to another facility to continue a longer sentence. Community corrections are oftentimes a little bit harder to define because they take up many forms. So when we're talking community confinement or community corrections, we're talking like a community treatment center could be a form of community corrections, a halfway house, restitution center, mental health facility, alcohol or drug rehab, other community correctional facilities like a residential reentry program, anything other than juvenile facilities is typically what we would consider community confinement. Okay. And then the other thing to note is that individuals that reside in any of these as part of the term of their imprisonment or as a condition to pre-trial release or post-release supervision are required to participate in gaining employment or employment search efforts, community service, vocational training, treatment, educational programs, and similar to some other facility approved programs during non-residential hours. The other thing to know is that in Maryland, there are many relevant agencies, but the four main agencies that oversee PREA, again, would be the Federal Bureau of Prisons, our Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, the Department of Juvenile Services, and then the County Department of Corrections, our DOC. Now, when it comes to immigration detention, that is oftentimes managed by the federal agency ICE, known as Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so state and local facilities can sometimes house ICE detainees under a contract. So how that usually works is that they have a contract between ICE and that facility to be able to house those detainees for them. But immigration detention is a civil and administrative detention, not criminal. So oftentimes when we're doing immigration detention, it's not because of something criminal that a person has done. It's usually a civil situation or an administration situation. And then the last thing I'll note is that the standards for immigration detainees are actually a separate set released by the Department of Homeland Security, but they're very similar to PREA. Okay, so ICE has a completely different set of standards that is different than PREA. So now let's talk a little bit about intersectionality. So it is important to note that people are not monoliths, right? No one group is the same because no one person holds just one identity. And so some of you may be familiar with the term intersectionality. It was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer and a professor at UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School. And she coined the term intersectionality back in 1989 to describe the intersection of identities and power. So, for example, she discussed how a Black man can experience discrimination because he's Black, and a white woman can experience discrimination because she's a woman. But a Black woman, right, can experience a completely different type of discrimination because she's both a woman and Black. And so the way her intersecting identities are treated gives her a very different life experience than someone who does not experience both these forms of discrimination at once, right? So in this case, she's talking both racial and gender discrimination. Another example of intersectionality can be an organization that has discriminatory hiring practices, right? So this organization typically would hire white women, right, and hire Black men just to be able to say something like, see, we're not racist or we're not sexist, right? But they may refuse to hire Black women. And that in itself is being discriminatory and is usually an easier way to excuse. So the intersection of our identities and the power associated with those identities oftentimes impacts how we see the world, how the world sees us, and how we're treated. It's also important to note that we also know that there are populations that are underserved, not just because of identity, but also because of circumstances, right? So again, we look at people like homeless people or the incarcerated, right? Statistically, folks with the marginalized identities are more likely to be filtered into those circumstances. And so this conversation around identity is just the framework for a lot of the conversations we need to have. And so it's important to know that someone from an underserved population is someone who holds one or many identities that have been historically and or currently oppressed. So now let's talk a little bit about oppression. What is oppression? One of the best definitions that I've heard of oppression is that it's basically a perpetual state of disadvantage, right? And so the idea of oppression is not that people can pull themselves up by the bootstraps, right? Oppression is rooted in historic, systematic, ingrained trauma, right? And so it oftentimes shape again how we see the world and how the world sees us, right? All forms of oppression are perpetuated by the belief of this concept that there must be power over versus power shared. So, how does oppression show up for a survivor of sexual violence from an underserved population? So, I'll give you a few examples. If we're looking at someone from an undocumented immigrant, right, oppression can show up like the fear of being deported, right? If they come forward and they report being sexually assaulted, say by an employer, there's this fear of like, if I tell somebody, if I ask for help, I might face deportation. If we look at a Black woman survivor, oppression can show up as being dismissive of her pain or her experience, maybe even downplaying it, right? Based on some outdated beliefs and ideology, right? Historically, we know that Black women have been seen as less vulnerable and less credible, and oftentimes hypersexualized. It can also look like if we're working with an indigenous or two-spirited survivor, that they're not receiving culturally competent services and we're dismissing their cultural beliefs. In many indigenous cultures, they believe in traditional healing, right, versus westernized ways of doing healing. So oppression can look like not having those type of services in place or not having a referral to those types of services and or dismissing their cultural beliefs. For a member of the LGBTQIA plus, it can look like not respecting their gender expression or misgenderizing them, right? Which further isolates them as a survivor. For a disabled survivor, it can look like questioning whether or not they were the actual victim of the sexual assault because they have a disability. And then for an incarcerated survivor, it can look like being frequently denied access to proper health care and proper mental health services after being sexually assaulted. Here's the thing I want you to know. One of the most important connections that we have to make here is that oppression operates via the system of power. People who hold one or many dominant identities are given unearned power in society. And people who hold one or more marginalized identities are rendered powerless. This is how the hierarchy works. One group has power, the other one is rendered powerless. And so it's going to be important to talk when we're talking anti-sexual violence work, it's going to be so important that we also talk about anti-oppression, right? We can't talk about how to be anti-sexually violent if we're not also making sure that we recognize that sexual violence is a power-based attack, right? That's rooted in racism, that's rooted in sexism, that's rooted in ableism, that's rooted in anti-LGBTQ, that's rooted in anti-Black. It's rooted in those things. And so this violence is used to perpetuate oppression of those targeted groups, right? And so we know that anyone of any identity can be a victim of sexual violence, but it is also important to recognize that there are those who hold marginalized identities who are oftentimes deemed powerless by society that have a higher risk of being targeted. Again, some of those people can be those with mental illness, those who are from the transgender community, someone that's homeless, an indigenous person, children, all of them have an extreme high rate of sexual violence. And so, again, if we advocate for anti oppression work, we cannot eliminate sexual violence because, again, it is most often used historically and still today as a tool of social control, physical domination, and power to sustain oppression of marginalized groups and maintain power for the abuser. The last thing I will say is to get to the root of sexual violence, you must advocate for an equal and equitable society, right? Part of the journey is going to be eliminating our own personal bias because we all have them, right? Expanding our personal and professional networks, improving access to our institutions for marginalized people, and enhancing support of marginalized people within our institutions. So now let's talk a little bit about the four elements of oppression. And so the four elements oppression looks at four key areas: defined norm, institutional power, violence and or threat of violence, and economic power, right? So if you look over to the left side of your screen in the defined norms category, you see a lot of those dominant identities that we talked about in the beginning, right? So the defined norm really established what is considered normal in our society, right? So normal, again, is oftentimes white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied individuals. That is the standard, that is the norm within our society. And then those who are considered marginalized and underserved are oftentimes perceived as the others, right? So they're not the standard. Based on defined norms, we unfortunately have created harmful stereotypes, right? Such as the hypersexualization of Black women or the invisibility of LGBTQIA plus survivors, right? Which further isolates them, right? Because of defined norms, it impacts credibility. So survivors that are outside of what we deem normal in our society are oftentimes seen less credible, less deserving of protection and support. All right. Now let's look at institutional power. When we start thinking about institutional power and oppression, right, we start to look at where does this show up? So in some cases in the systems, we look at our healthcare system, our military system, law enforcement, political representation, educational system, legal system, right? And so oppression shows up as systematic barriers, right? So when it comes to legal, healthcare, and social services institutions, they oftentimes favor those who, again, align with what we deem normal versus those who are marginalized, right? Which leads to that discrimination within those systems. Marginalized survivors may face biased policing. They may face bias in the courtroom. They may face bias in the HR systems that dismiss their claims. They also may deal with lack of cultural competence and humility. So institutions oftentimes lack resources and training to understand and support the specific needs of marginalized survivors. Now let's take a little look at violence and threat of violence, right? So when we're looking at violence and threat of violence, we're looking at both direct violence and threats of violence. So survivors from marginalized communities oftentimes experience higher rates of physical, sexual, emotional, and financial violence due to things like systematic racism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. When it comes to threats of violence, we see that there's a fear of retaliation from the abuser. There's the fear of deportation, family and community backlash. Tack that on with the state sanctioned violence. So that over policing, racial profiling, other forms of violence that disproportionately impact those from marginalized communities. And then the last element of oppression, economic power, right? So this is where we start to look at like employment opportunities, credit, lending practices, college course. So when it comes to marginalized survivors, there's a limited financial resources, lack of access to wealth and economic stability, workplace vulnerability. Marginalized survivors, particularly in immigrants or maybe low income individuals, oftentimes face sexual exploitation and other forms of sexual violence and are afraid to report these incidents at work due to fear of losing their job or being deported. Poverty as a barrier to justice, right? So not being able to afford legal services, right? Not being able to afford bail, not being able to get transportation to court. All of these are different ways that oppression shows up. So in the chat, we're going to do a quick activity, and I want to hear from you all. What are some forms of oppression that you've seen in the work that you do with survivors? Let me know in the chat. What are some things that you see? PTSD, women being questioned, lack of access to resources, experiences are minimized or dismissed. Yep. Financial, mental health issues, the police. Yep. Voices not being heard. That a true survivor can't have a criminal record. Yeah. hmm Trauma, fear of deportation. Yep. Transgender, victims afraid to report abuse due to the background. Yep. All of these are different forms of oppression. Homelessness, yes. Habitual reporter. hmm Awesome. Awesome. Unequal opportunity for promotion. Yeah. Y'all are hitting it right on the head. Awesome. Let's keep going. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the rape culture pyramid. So this pyramid was created by Virginia Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. It is definitely a wonderfully done visual representation of the way in which oppression is the foundation for sexual violence. So the structural forms of oppression cultivate a society in which the attitudes, the behaviors, and the policies, which you see higher up in the pyramid, become prevalent and pervasive. So you can see the terms at the bottom of our structure, right? These are the building blocks that oftentimes create additional harmful behaviors and attitudes towards those that are seen as minorities and marginalized people. So when it comes to sexual violence prevention, we cannot be successful unless we're willing to address this structural oppression, right? That is rooted in sexual violence. Things like racism, again, sexism, ableism, classism, colonialism, right? Xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, all of those things are just the foundation of the rape culture pyramid, which leads to the culture, which leads to the invasion of privacy, which leads to sexual harassment, which leads to sexual assault. This is why you cannot do anti-sexual assault work and not recognize oppression. So now let's talk a little bit about trauma, right? So what is trauma, right? Trauma is a normal response to an abnormal experience. I'm gonna say that again. It is a normal response to an abnormal experience. right? So it's important to know that emotional and physical harm resulting from violence or conflict or some type of national disaster, all of those things can be a form of trauma. And so again, it is a normal response to abnormal experiences. And every survivor reacts to trauma in their own way. Right. So some signs that a person could be experiencing trauma might be things like flashbacks, triggers, other symptoms of PTSD, substance use, depression, anxiety, numbness or disassociation, avoidance, hyperarousal, impacted sense of identity, eating disorders, sleep disorders, self-harm, suicidal ideations, or attempts. It's important to know that there are several types of trauma, and we will not go through all of them today, but I do want to highlight specifically these four: collective trauma, historical trauma, cultural trauma, and structurally induced trauma. So let's talk a little bit about collective trauma. So collective trauma is trauma that impacts individuals and or groups, right? So we're looking at examples like gender-based violence, institutional racism, colonialism. That's collective trauma. I would even tack on COVID-19 as a collective trauma, right? Then you have historical trauma. So historical trauma looks at emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, right? And so some examples of historical trauma are things like slavery, genocide, apartheid, environmental degradation, right? Transgenerational trauma can also be a form of historical trauma, because when we talk historical trauma, it's always important to look at how trauma is oftentimes transferred from one generation to another, right? Which oftentimes adds to that complex post-traumatic stress disorder that we oftentimes see, or anxiety. So an example of that could be like the descendants from the Holocaust survivors were found that they had elevated heart rates. So when we talk historical trauma, it's always important to include transgenerational trauma too. Cultural trauma can occur when attempts are made to eradicate part or all of a culture or people. So some examples of cultural trauma could be Holocaust, right? Or homophobia and transphobia, white supremacy, assimilation, genocide of people, right? That would be an example of cultural trauma. Cultural practices that oftentimes create dignity violations or harm other cultures. So, like, for example, female genitalia mutation or toxic masculinity, secrecy within families, right? And in churches, that's an example of cultural trauma. And then we have structurally induced trauma. So, structurally induced trauma is trauma created by policies that result in unjust, abusive, racist, homophobic, or unsafe systems that cause hardship, often on a long term continuous basis. So we look at examples like the prison industrial system, right? The USA's policy about going abroad, capitalism, right? All of those things are example of structurally induced trauma. So it's important to know that these traumas are important to keep in mind, because when an individual survives a sexual assault, they may be dealing with trauma after the event, right? However, if they are from a marginalized identity, they may already be living with cultural trauma or transgenerational trauma, right? That is unrelated to the assault. So you're oftentimes, when you're working in marginalized communities, you're dealing with compounding traumas, right? Which oftentimes impacts their ability to seek help, to navigate support systems, and their ability to heal from what has happened to them. So now we're going to talk a little bit about barriers or potential barriers to accessing support services, right? So again, no community is monolith. Everyone experiences abuse is different. and their trauma response is different, and how they move through the world with many of their identities is going to be different as well. So again, real quick, what are some of the barriers that you all have seen when working with those from marginalized identities? Drop some in the chat. Insurance or lack of insurance. Financial and transportation. Yep. Fear of police and other authorities. Emergency housing shortage. Fear of appraisal. Shame. Yep. Food and medication. Not having someone who looks like them. Yep. Representation. Mental health. hmm Any others? Criminal records. Definitely can be a barrier. Not being believed or validated. Financial stability, lack of PCP or lack of support system, fear of retaliation, cultural stigma, and ostracization. Yes. Good, good, good. Love it. All right, let's continue. So let's talk about barriers to exceed accessing services. So again, this is not an exhaustive list. And so the way I like to explain barriers is we have two sets of barriers when working with underserved populations. You have the barriers to accessing services, which is why are they not coming to our organization's doors? Why are they not showing up and getting help? So we're going to talk about accessing services first. And then we'll talk about accepting services. And accepting services is all about why can we get them to stay? So here are some barriers when it comes to accessing services. The first barrier is that there's this fear of being outed or coming out. If a marginalized or underrepresented survivor comes to your doors and they are a part of their, say they're Black and they're also LGBTQIA plus, but nobody knows that they're a part of the LGBTQIA plus community. There is this huge fear that if I come to your organization's doors and I ask for help, I am going to have to either come out or I'm going to be outed. Tack that on with this fear of I'm not going to be believed. For many in marginalized communities, that is a huge fear. Nobody's going to believe me if I told them that I went to hang out with some friends, had a few drinks, and this is what happened. Nobody's going to believe me if I'm a sex worker and I just so happen to be outside, and I ended up getting sexually assaulted. That's a huge barrier. Another barrier is the relationship with the offender, right? What if I am undocumented and I have to rely on someone to help me financially? And the person I'm relying on to help me financially is also the one that's abusing me and violating me. I can't come ask you for help because I depend on this person. That's a barrier. The fear of what happens after the report. For many people in marginalized communities, law enforcement is not their friend. So if I come to you and I tell you what happened, are you going to be quick to call the police or some other authority? That's a huge barrier. Fear of how they or their community will be perceived. What if I come to your organization's doors and again, I'm a sex worker? Are you going to think that all sex workers are getting sexually violated? Are you going to have your own? Am I going to have to deal with your implicit bias, your prejudice? That's a huge barrier. Fear of police brutality or other forms of violence from the state. Again, I have a mistrust with this system. Your organization represents the system. Am I going to have to deal with, again, some type of violence if I come through your organization's doors? And then fear that service providers will not understand or affirm their identities. So not only am I a Black person, but maybe I'm of the LGBTQIA, and maybe I use they as my pronouns, but I look like a female, so you keep misgendering me. That's a real barrier. And so these are the barriers as to why many survivors in marginalized communities are not coming to your organization's doors. So now let's talk about why you can't get them to stay. Because that's another set of barriers. And I broke this down intentionally like this because I want you all to understand this is what you're up against when you're working with a survivor from a marginalized identity. You are dealing with two sets of barriers on top of the traumas, on top of the sexual violence. So here's the reasons why you can't get them to stay. One, the stigma and shame that comes with being sexually violated and being from a marginalized community. In many marginalized communities and cultures, people of color, Black people, we are in a culture of silence. If you like me, I was raised by a grandmother from the deep South, and she used to always say, "What happens in this house stays in this house." Right? So in our cultures, stigma and shame is embedded, right? Silence is embedded, right? My grandma used to always say, "Don't go get them people in our business." That's a real barrier. They're carrying that. That's just why they can't stay. Tack that on with the distrust in the legal system. I don't trust that you're going to help me. I don't trust the authorities. Tack that on with cultural barriers such as secrecy in the household. In many marginalized communities, secrecy is rooted in their household. We are taught to protect the perpetrator. Keep quiet. Don't talk about these things. Tack that on with historical trauma that people of color have experienced, like being experimented on. Gender and sexual orientation stigma, again, misgenderizing, inadequate healthcare systems. That's a real barrier, especially for our marginalized communities that are out in rural communities. You know, I grew up in New York City. And I used to always tell people some of the best healthcare was all the way on Long Island. But if I live in the city and I don't have transportation to get to the best, that means I got to settle for inadequate healthcare systems. That's a real barrier. Somebody mentioned this in the chat, lack of representation. If I'm a person of color or a Black person or indigenous or LGBTQIA plus, Latinx, and I walk in your organization's doors, am I going to see someone that look like me beyond the receptionist? Because in a lot of marginalized communities, representation matters. I feel safe when I see someone that looks like me. Tack that on with economic disparities, such as not earning a livable wage. You mean I have to choose between going to work and getting a paycheck to feed my family and take care of my babies and coming to your organization to get help? Which one you think I'm gonna choose? Tack that on with institutional barriers, such as lack of proper procedures, retaliation, and disbelief. So as an organization, not being properly set up from assessment all the way to support, that's a real barrier. Language barriers. So if I walk in your organization's doors and I speak Spanish, do you have somebody that's there that can translate? Or do I have to wait for you to call a number and get somebody on the language line that can translate for me? Tack that on with stereotypes and misconceptions, right? That's a barrier that they're up against. And then the last one being lack of trauma informed care. Does your organization understand trauma? Does it understand that trauma looks differently for everyone? Does it understand that it's not supposed to be one size fit all and that what works for one is supposed to work for everyone? Because that's not how this works. Both sets of barriers are the reasons why we have to be very, very trauma informed, culturally sensitive when working with survivors in underserved populations. Now let's talk a little bit about the barriers of incarcerated survivors, right? So we got barrier on top of barrier. Now, if you work with incarcerated survivors, here are some of the barriers that they're facing, on top of the fact that they can't come to your organization's doors, on top of the fact that if they do show up, they're not staying. For many incarcerated survivors, right, we're looking at stigma and blame. Incarcerated survivors oftentimes face judgment and shame from their community because of their criminal history, which oftentimes make it even harder for them to be believed and to be supported as a victim of sexual violence. Tack that on with the mistrust in the justice system, right? So survivors oftentimes have a very deep mistrust for both the justice system and community resources. So understand, for all of you that in these organizations, you represent the system. And so because there's this mistrust in the justice system, right, because of their past experiences, because of things like discrimination or mistreatment, they're very reluctant to ask for help. Isolation and alienation. Being incarcerated already isolates individuals from their community. So they're already isolated, and then they're further isolated because now they experience sexual violence, which limits their access to their family, limits their access to their support networks, oftentimes further alienating them. Tack that on with criminalization of victimhood. As an incarcerated survivor, you are more likely to be seen as the perpetrator than the victim, which again means that their sexual violence experience is overlooked and minimized because of their criminal status. Cultural and family expectations. Many survivors from certain cultural or familial backgrounds may feel pressured to remain silent about their abuse. Again, due to societal norms that stigmatize victims, especially those in marginalized communities. Economic and social disconnection. So upon being released, many survivors struggle to reintegrate back into these communities because there's a lack of resources, a lack of support system, again, making it even harder for them to seek ongoing care and healing from their trauma. Tack that on with lack of confidentiality. So survivors oftentimes fear that speaking with advocates, right, may not be confidential, especially within the correctional facilities where their safety is oftentimes jeopardized because they might be exposed as a victim. Tack that on with the limited access to advocacy services. So because of institutional restrictions or lack of resources, incarcerated survivors oftentimes have limited access to those outside advocates or those outside support programs, oftentimes resulting in fewer opportunities for them to get help. Language and communication barriers. So for those survivors who are non-English speaking or have a disability, right, or face other communication challenges, right, they may struggle to be able to effectively engage with advocates, hindering their ability to really share their experiences and seek proper support. Fear of retaliation, right? So this fear that they may not be fully protected from retaliation or punishment from prison staff or their fellow inmates, making it even more difficult for survivors to trust that working with advocates will result in some positive outcome. Cultural and racial disconnect. So again, working with individuals who are not trained in cultural sensitivity, who don't have an understanding of the unique needs of incarcerated survivors, especially those from marginalized communities, oftentimes lead to that lack of trust or effective support. And then the bureaucratic challenges, right? So the prison system has very rigid structure and complex challenges, such as paperwork, that oftentimes can slow down the advocacy process, and survivors may face delays or denials when really trying to access the support they need. It's important to know, though, that incarceration by itself inherently limits someone's freedom, which adds even more complex barriers, such as limited phone access, fear of retaliation from the person that assaulted them, being looked at differently by other inmates because they reported the assault. So, how do we move forward? We know the old way. So, what's the new way? Let's talk about it. The new way starts with recognizing the socio-ecological model. And so the socio-ecological model is a way of looking at all levels of influence. So it starts on the individual level and goes to interpersonal, organizational, community, and public policy. So it's important to know that discrimination, oppression, microaggressions are experienced on all levels of this model, right? And so as you reflect on making your work more inclusive for people of all identities, I want you to consider each level of the model, because many times we get stuck right there on the individual level, right? Or even our interpersonal levels. And so to work to make structural change is to systematic oppression, we have to look beyond just individual in our interpersonal level, right? And get into all the other areas of the level, like organization, community, and public policy. So to break down this model, right, on an individual level, we're talking about knowledge, attitude, and skills, right? So some examples might be avoiding assumptions, right? Never assume that you know somebody's orientation, being aware of your own implicit bias. Um, don't assume that you know everything about a community, right? That's an example of just the individual aspect of this model. From an interpersonal level, excuse me, when we look at interpersonal level, we look at things like being able to use simple language when you're talking with survivors, right? Or communicating about a survivor. So knowing terminology that you use. I always tell individuals, make sure that you're mirroring back to the person with language they're using. So if someone identifies as a victim, right? You use the word victim. If they identify as a survivor, use the word survivor. But also on an interpersonal level, we're looking at our social network. So some examples of those things might be, what are you reading? What are you watching? What are you listening to that amplifies marginalized voices, right? Are you going to community events? Are you getting involved on your campuses for those who work in campuses? On your social media, are you incorporating the narratives of those from marginalized populations that may not be getting mainstream media? From an organizational standpoint, we're looking at our environment, we're looking at our social institutions, right? So some examples of that might be, do you have ways of communicating with anyone that comes through your organization's doors, right? So again, interpreters or resources or someone on staff that speaks various different languages. Do you use things like assistant technology or ASL or Braille, right? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about organization. How are you gathering your data about the people you're serving? Right? Are you looking at local data? Are you looking at national data? Like how are you getting the information? Also in the organization, also in the organizational, we're looking at um, who you are hiring, right? So if you are somebody that's in charge of hiring, are you paying attention to who you're hiring? Do you have that diverse leadership, right? Are you looking at your paperwork and your forms? Are you ensuring that they have things like pronouns on there? All of that is organization. And then also in organization, being clear about the limitations in your organization, right? So making sure that you're not over promising and under delivering, right? So being clear about what you can and cannot do, but also having those resources available for those survivors to take their next steps. Also in organization, we're looking at things like policy, right? So are you making sure that you're inclusive in all of your policies, right? And then we start to get into the community part of the ecological model. So in the community, we're looking at cultural values, norms, and relationships between organizations. So who are you collaborating? Who are you doing outreach with? Are you reaching out to different communities and spaces? Are you building relationships with those that are in your community, especially those that serve the populations that you're servicing, right? Are you sharing knowledge with those individuals, right? We're also looking things at like transportation opportunities and options, right? So how accessible is your organization? All right. Are you working with your local officials to advocate for inclusive laws and policies? And then the last part of the socio-ecological model is public policy. So we're looking at our state, local laws and regulations. So we're looking at things like voters' rights, right? Those that work on college campuses, work that you might do with student government, building relationships with your local politicians and those that are um, actively doing the work to help bring better laws and policies to our state. So that's the socio-ecological model. So now let's talk a little bit about equity. So I absolutely love this picture. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation had this picture on their website, and it is an incredible comparison between what we consider equality and equity, right? And so if you look at this picture, equality shows four people with the same exact bike, right? So they all have the same bike, meaning that they're all being treated equal because they all have the same resource. The problem with equality is that it does not accommodate their individual needs, right? Because if you look at the picture, you have somebody on a wheelchair. They can't get on that bike, right? Or you have somebody that's really tall that now has to scrunch over. He can't, he feel uncomfortable, right? And so equality is this notion that I give the same resources to everybody and they get the same thing and everybody gets the same equal opportunities. And that's just not how this works. We have to be more equitable, right? And so equity shows that some same four people, but all four of them are on different bikes, right? So they're not given the same resource. They're all given a bike that meets their individual needs, right? And so again, it's so important to know that people are not one size fit all, right? And so you probably are thinking to yourself, well, listen, we've been doing it like this for years. It seems to work. Why do we need to change now, right? Well, we need to change now because the work that we've been doing for years is not including everybody, right? And so we have to make sure that we're including everybody in the work that we're doing. And we have to become more inclusive in our interactions, in our organization, in our legislator, right? So it's important to know that equality is treating others how we want to be treated. Equity is treating others how they want to be treated. Okay. So as we wrap up, I do not want to exit this training without giving you an opportunity to make a commitment to yourself. So what are some things that you can begin to implement after today's training? Drop it in the chat. What are some things you're going to implement? Check my own bias. Yes, I love it because we all have it. Any others? What are some things you're going to do differently going forward after today's training? I'll be more mindful as to how I view things, my beliefs. Yes. Advocate more. I love it. Educate myself on the cultures and communities I'll be working with. Yes. Love it. Be mindful of how equality and equity are different, very different. Work with my kids, school to serve underserved communities. I love it. Call out bias and prejudice, being more mindful of equity versus equality. Everyone is unique. Be aware in regard to my approach. Yes, 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 yes. Raise more awareness. I love it. Provide all my resources and educate non-judgmental. Great. Awesome. Awesome. Well, that concludes our training for today. Again, I'm Leah Forney. I'm the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate here at MCASA. I'm also the coordinator for the Maryland Women of Color Network here at MCASA. And so it has been an honor to serve each and every one of you. I'll be here for questions and I will turn it over to you, Alyssa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. So I just posted the anonymous evaluation link into the chat. Again, we greatly appreciate all feedback as we are constantly striving to improve. If you are seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for social work CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll see a box at the top of your webpage containing a link. And if you click on that link, you'll be able to access the certificate request form. I'll be sending out a follow-up email either later today or tomorrow morning with a copy of today's video recording, the PowerPoint slides, and the evaluation link. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or you can respond to that email when I send it out. And as Leah said, we'll hang back for questions.